Welcome, fellow explorers of all sorts, to the All Sorts podcast. You know we love to take deep dives into captivating subjects, and today we're diving headfirst into a world where, well, honestly, where appearances can be deceiving. We're talking about Maskirovka, the Soviet system of camouflage.
It's often just translated as camouflage, but honestly, that doesn't even begin to cover it. Think of it as like this grand tapestry, but it's woven with strategy, psychology, and this deep understanding of how we see the world.
You've already got me hooked. I'll admit I kind of had this simple idea of Maskirovka, just clever ways to hide things. But from what I've been reading in our sources, like NSTD 108, and CIA RDP 83M 0000171 0000000000019. It's way more than that. It's this intricate dance between hiding and revealing, misleading, and, well, just completely throwing the enemy off balance.
Exactly. Maskirovka works on so many levels, from hiding troops and equipment to manipulating the enemy's whole understanding of what you're doing, what you're capable of, even what kind of fighting force you really are.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely not just slapping some paint on a tank. So where did this whole idea come from? Was it a Cold War thing? Or does it go back further?
It's really intertwined with Russian history and military thinking. You see hints of it way back in ancient battles, using the terrain and the weather to their advantage. I mean, look at legendary figures like Alexander Nevsky and Peter the Great.
So it's almost like a cultural inheritance, like this way of thinking that's been passed down for generations of Russian military leaders.
Exactly. And that's a key part of understanding why Maskirovka was so effective. It wasn't just techniques for the Soviets, it was a philosophy, a part of their strategic DNA.
That's fascinating. It makes you realize that deception isn't just about tricks and gadgets. It's a mindset, a deep understanding of how to play with your enemy's perceptions and expectations.
Precisely. And the Soviets had this unique advantage, this connection to the vast Russian landscape.
You know, it's something that really struck me in the sources, this idea of Soviet soldiers having this almost mystical bond with nature, like they could just disappear into the forests or the steppes, as if they were part of the environment itself.
One German general even described it as a kinship with nature. He noticed how Soviet soldiers just instinctively used the terrain to their advantage, the vegetation, the changing light, everything.
That's incredible. It's like they had this built-in camouflage advantage, a sixth sense for blending in.
And it wasn't just individual soldiers. The Soviets applied this to everything they did, using the vastness of their territory, the harsh winters, even just the unpredictability of the environment to help their deception.
So the whole Russian landscape became like a part of their Maskirovka arsenal. That's mind-blowing. But besides this connection to nature, how did they actually put this approach into practice? Did they have a framework or like a set of rules?
Absolutely. Maskirovka had this cultural foundation, but it was also very structured. Sources like NSTD 108 talk about four main components. They call them the pillars of Maskirovka: concealment, imitation, demonstration maneuvers, and disinformation.
Okay, let's break those down. Concealment, that seems pretty straightforward. It's about hiding things, right?
Yeah, but it's more than just hiding in plain sight. It's about using everything you can to mask your true strength, your location, and your goals, so the enemy can't figure you out. This could be traditional camouflage, you know, like nets foliage paint.
So like making tanks look like trees and troops vanish into the forest?
Exactly. But it's more than just visuals. The Soviets were masters of using the terrain itself. Ravines, forests, even mountains. They also knew how to exploit the weather. Fog, darkness, blizzards.
So they were thinking three-dimensionally, using every part of the battle space to create this cloak of concealment.
Exactly. They even masked their electronic signatures, reducing their radar and radio emissions, so it was harder to detect them electronically.
That's amazing. They were making these invisible pockets on the battlefield, making it almost impossible for the enemy to get a clear picture.
And that's just a first layer of the Maskirovka onion. Now let's move on to imitation.
Okay, imitation. Sounds intriguing. What were they imitating?
Pretty much anything and everything. They were masters at creating decoys, dummy tanks, fake artillery positions, even whole airfields. They used inflatables, wooden structures, lights and sounds to create the illusion of activity where there was none.
So they weren't just hiding, they were creating these phantom armies, these ghost divisions.
Yeah.
To fool the enemy.
Exactly. Can you imagine trying to plan an attack when you're not even sure what's real? It would be a nightmare.
It's like next level psychological warfare. You're not just fighting the enemy, you're fighting their perception of reality.
And that's where demonstration maneuvers come in. This is about actively misleading the enemy, not just through passive things like hiding, but through deliberate actions.
Okay, so they're putting on a show for the enemy. What kind of maneuvers are we talking about?
Think feint false attacks, troop movements designed to draw attention away from the real objective. They might send a small unit on a very obvious advance towards a seemingly important target, while the main force is secretly massing somewhere else for a surprise attack.
So it's like a magician's sleight of hand, directing your gaze to one hand while the real trick is happening with the other.
Precisely. They created these elaborate theatrical performances on the battlefield,
Yeah.
all carefully choreographed.
That's brilliant. Maskirovka was as much an art as it was a science. They were playing with perception, with psychology.
And that brings us to disinformation. This is where they took deception beyond the physical and into the world of information warfare.
Okay, disinformation. Sounds like something straight out of a spy novel. What kind of tactics did they use?
Planted rumors, fabricated documents, leaked information. Designed to mislead enemy intelligence. They might spread false reports about troop movements, create fake battle plans, manipulate radio communications, to create the illusion of strength in one area while weakness existed elsewhere.
So they were hacking into the enemy's information systems, feeding them lies.
Not always hacking in the modern sense, but definitely manipulating the flow of information. They knew that in war, knowledge is power, and by controlling what the enemy knew or thought they knew, they could gain a huge advantage.
That's incredible. It's like they were playing a multi-dimensional chess game, where the battlefield wasn't just the physical front lines, it was also the realm of perception of information, of the enemy's very understanding of reality.
And remember, this was all happening before the internet, before social media, before the information landscape became as complex as it is today.
That's kind of a scary thought, but we'll get into that later. So we've got the 4 pillars of Maskirovka: concealment, imitation, demonstration maneuvers, and disinformation. But were these just random tactics, or was there like a philosophy, a set of guidelines that tied it all together?
There absolutely was. The Soviets had specific principles that guided their Maskirovka operations. Documents like CIA RDP 83 AO 0000171 R 000000000000001-9 laid them out, making sure their deception efforts were part of a cohesive system.
Okay, I'm ready to hear about these principles. What's the first one?
Activity. They believed that deception wasn't passive. It needed constant effort, a continuous stream of actions and manipulations to keep the enemy off balance, guessing and misinformed.
So it's not enough to just set up a few decoys and call it a day.
Exactly. You have to keep the illusion going. Reinforce those false perceptions with new actions, new deceptions. That way the enemy doesn't get complacent and start to recognize the ruse.
So they're constantly weaving this tapestry of deception, adding new threads and patterns.
Precisely. And that leads to the second principle, naturalness. The Soviets understood that for deception to work, it had to blend in with their normal activities.
So those fake tank movements would look like regular supply runs. The dummy artillery positions would blend in with real defenses.
Exactly. The goal was to create this sense of normalcy.
To make the enemy think everything was fine, while they were being completely misled. It's like hiding in plain sight on a strategic level.
Exactly. And that leads us to diversity. They knew that using the same tricks over and over would get them caught.
So mix it up, keep them guessing.
Exactly. They might use camouflage one day, decoys the next, disinformation after that, and combine them in unpredictable ways.
A kaleidoscope of deception.
And finally, the most crucial principle, continuity. Maskirovka wasn't something you just turned on and off. It was a constant part of their military doctrine, from peacetime to wartime.
So even when things were calm, they were still working in the background, planting seeds of doubt, shaping perceptions, getting ready for future deceptions.
Exactly. They knew that the best deceptions start long before the fighting begins.
That's brilliant and unsettling at the same time. It makes you think that with Maskirovka, there's always a game being played.
Exactly. It's a constant game of smoke and mirrors.
This is incredible. We've gone from basic camouflage to this complex world of strategic deception.
And we've only scratched the surface. Remember, this wasn't a static system. It evolved, adapted to new technologies, new challenges.
And that's what I'm curious about. How did they take this ancient art of deception and bring it into the modern world? Did they stick with the same old tricks? Or did they find ways to innovate?
That's a great question, and one we'll dive into right after this. Maskirovka is all about adapting. Just like a chameleon changes its colors to blend in, Maskirovka changed to match the changing ways wars were fought.
So how did the Soviets take this ancient art of deception and bring it into like the 20th and 21st centuries? Do they have any new tricks for the modern world?
Oh, they had a whole bunch of tricks. One really interesting one is how they used corner reflectors to mess with radar.
Corner reflectors. That sounds more like physics class than a spy movie. What are they exactly?
Picture this simple device made of metal plates. They're arranged in a way that bounces radar waves back to where they came from, creating a much stronger signal than the object itself would normally give off.
So like radar amplifiers.
Exactly. The Soviets would place these reflectors strategically to create these fake armies, illusory tank columns, even non-existent bridges.
Wow, that's sneaky. So they weren't just hiding from radar, they were manipulating it to create these elaborate illusions.
Exactly. This not only hid their real movements, but it could also lure enemy aircraft or missiles towards these fake targets, wasting their resources and potentially saving lives on the Soviet side.
So clever. It's like they use the enemy's own technology against them.
And this is just one example of how Maskirovka adapted to new technologies. As the world became more and more reliant on information, the Soviets realized that the real battle wasn't just physical anymore, it was informational.
So Maskirovka went digital. How did they do that?
In a way, yes. It was like the evolution of planting rumors and manipulating intelligence. But now, on a global scale, they started using things like mass media propaganda and eventually the internet to shape people's perceptions and influence decision-making.
Playing mind games on a global scale? What kind of tactics did they use?
Leaking carefully crafted disinformation to journalists, planting stories in foreign newspapers, even creating fake social media accounts to spread propaganda and create discord.
That sounds like something straight out of a modern spy thriller. Did this digital Maskirovka actually work? Did it have any real-world impact?
It's hard to say for sure, because Maskirovka is all about being ambiguous and deniable. But think about the annexation of Crimea in 2014.
Crimea, those little green men soldiers without any insignia appearing out of nowhere, that created a lot of confusion.
Exactly. The element of surprise, the uncertainty about who these forces were and what they were up to, allowed Russia to achieve its goals before the world could react.
That's a chilling example of how Maskirovka can create this fog of war. Not just on the battlefield, but in the global information space.
And that fog can be really disorienting, making it almost impossible to separate truth from lies.
It makes you wonder how much of what we see happening in the world today is influenced by this kind of strategic deception. Are we all just pawns in some global game of Maskirovka?
It's a question worth thinking about, but before we get too lost in the present, let's go back in time for a bit and see how Maskirovka played out in some of history's most famous battles.
Okay, let's get some historical context. I want to see how these principles of deception worked in real-life situations. Where should we start?
One of the most amazing examples of Maskirovka in action is the Battle of Stalingrad. That was a brutal turning point in World War II.
Stalingrad, one of the most intense and decisive battles of the war. How did Maskirovka factor into it?
The Soviets knew they needed a big win at Stalingrad, and Maskirovka was a key part of their plan. They were incredibly secretive about building up their forces for the counteroffensive.
So they were secretly amassing troops and equipment right under the Germans' noses?
Exactly. They even built defensive lines that were deliberately weak, so the Germans would see them during reconnaissance. This made the Germans think the Soviets were just preparing for a long defense, not a massive counterattack.
Reverse psychology at its finest. But what about aerial reconnaissance? Wouldn't the Germans have spotted something eventually?
That's where the other element of Maskirovka came in. They launched diversionary attacks far away from Stalingrad to keep the Germans guessing about their real intentions. And they used those dummy tanks and artillery we talked about earlier, placing them cleverly to draw German bombing raids away from their real troops.
It's like they were putting on this elaborate play to fool the enemy. Did it work?
Completely. The Germans are totally convinced that the Soviets were weak and couldn't launch a major attack. That miscalculation cost them dearly.
So when the Soviets finally launched their counteroffensive, the Germans were totally caught off guard.
Exactly. Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive, achieved complete surprise. They encircled the German Sixth Army and eventually forced them to surrender. It was a turning point in the war.
What an amazing example of how Maskirovka can change the course of a battle. Are there any other battles where it played a big role?
Absolutely. The Battle of Kursk in 1943, another major battle on the Eastern Front, shows how Maskirovka could be used defensively. The Germans were planning a huge offensive, hoping to turn things around after their defeat at Stalingrad. The Soviets knew about the German plans and prepared for them, using Maskirovka to strengthen their defenses.
So they were on the defensive, but still using deception as part of their strategy.
Yes. They created a whole network of fake trenches, dummy artillery positions, and decoy tanks, all designed to mislead German intelligence about their real strength.
And did they use disinformation at Kursk, too?
Absolutely. They fed the Germans false information through double agents and intercepted communications, leading them to believe that the Soviet defenses were weaker than they really were, and that the Soviets would react slowly.
So when the Germans attacked, they walked straight into a trap.
Exactly. The Battle of Kursk was a brutal fight, one of the biggest tank battles in history. But the Soviets' use of Maskirovka had given them a huge advantage. The Germans were expecting an easy victory, but instead they got bogged down in a war of attrition against well-prepared defenses and suffered heavy losses.
Amazing. These examples really show the power of Maskirovka, but didn't it kind of rely on the enemy being gullible?
That's a fair point. But Maskirovka isn't just about hoping the enemy will fall for anything. It's about skillfully taking advantage of their existing biases, assumptions, and patterns of thinking. The Germans, for example, tended to underestimate the Soviets. They thought the Soviets were less sophisticated and technologically behind.
So their arrogance blinded them to the possibility of such elaborate deception.
Exactly. Maskirovka works best when it reinforces what the enemy already believes, nudging them towards decisions that benefit you.
That's fascinating. So deception isn't just about what you show the enemy, it's also about what they expect to see.
Exactly. It's about manipulating perceptions.
This is all mind-blowing. We've seen how effective Maskirovka was during wartime, especially in those massive battles on the Eastern Front. But our sources say it wasn't just limited to the battlefield, right?
That's right. The Soviets understood that deception could be just as useful during peacetime, especially during the Cold War when the stakes were so high.
So they were playing mind games even when there wasn't active fighting.
Take the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, for example. That was a moment when the world was on the brink of nuclear war.
Oh, yeah. Those tense 13 days in October when it felt like everything could end. How did the Soviets use Maskirovka during that crisis?
They were incredibly careful to hide the fact that they were putting nuclear missiles in Cuba. They disguised the shipments as agricultural equipment, transported them at night, and enforced strict radio silence.
Talk about high-stakes deception. Did the U.S. have any idea what was happening?
At first, the Soviets were very successful. The U.S. was totally surprised when U-2 spy plane photos finally revealed the missile sites.
That must have been a shock.
It was. It led to a diplomatic and military standoff. That brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before.
So in this case, Maskirovka almost backfired. It was their own deception that caused the crisis.
That's true. But it also shows how committed the Soviets were to deception, even when it risked making things worse with a superpower.
It shows how deeply ingrained this idea was in their thinking. They were willing to use it at the highest levels of international relations, even when the consequences could have been catastrophic.
Exactly. It reveals a fundamental difference in how they saw the world. For the Soviets, deception wasn't just a tactic, it was a way of life.
That's a sobering thought. It makes you realize that understanding Maskirovka is crucial to understanding how the world works.
Absolutely. It helps us make sense of current events, especially when it comes to Russia.
I'm definitely seeing things differently after this deep dive. But before we wrap up, I have one more question. We've seen how effective Maskirovka was in the past. But is it still relevant today?
That's the big question, isn't it? The world has changed a lot since the Cold War, with the internet, social media, instant global communication. But the basic principles of Maskirovka are still just as important.
So even though the tools and technologies have changed, the ideas of deception, misdirection, and manipulating perceptions are still being used.
Exactly. And the digital age has actually made it easier for Maskirovka to thrive. Think about how easy it is to manipulate narratives online, and how social media can be used to spread propaganda and sow discord.
It's like the fog of war isn't just on the battlefield anymore, it's everywhere.
Exactly. And in this environment where it's so hard to know what's true, the principles of Maskirovka are even more powerful. It's not just about deceiving military enemies anymore, it's about shaping public opinion, influencing politics, even manipulating financial markets.
So what does that mean for us? Are we just helpless victims of this global game of deception?
Not necessarily, but we do need to be more careful than ever. We need to be skeptical, question the information we see, and be wary of stories that seem too good to be true.
So critical thinking is our best defense.
It's a good place to start. We need to be aware that deception is happening, recognize the tactics, and learn how to tell the truth from lies. Remember, Maskirovka often plays on our emotions, our biases, our desire for simple answers.
So we need to be aware of our own weaknesses, our tendency to believe what we want to believe.
Exactly. Maskirovka thrives in the shadows. in the gaps between what we know and what we assume, in the uncertainties that cloud our judgment. By shining a light on those shadows, by questioning our assumptions, and by looking for different perspectives, we can start to see through the deception.
That's a powerful message. It's not about being cynical or distrusting everything. It's about being more discerning.
Exactly. Maskirovka is a reminder that the information landscape is a battlefield, and we're all fighting in this struggle for truth and perception.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening and a little bit scary. Show me a whole new side of strategic thinking.
It's been great exploring this topic with you. Remember, knowledge is power.
Fellow explorers of the curious and captivating. That's it for another episode of the All Sorts podcast. We've gone deep into the world of Maskirovka, learning about its history, its core principles, and how it's changed in the digital age.
We've seen how Maskirovka has shaped history, affecting the outcome of major battles and political confrontations, and we've talked about what it means for us today, in a world where it's harder than ever to tell what's real and what's not.
If you're as fascinated by Maskirovka as we are, check out the sources we mentioned, especially NSTD 108 and CIA RDP 83 M0000171R 0000023300001-9. They give you a really in-depth look at this world of strategic deception.
And remember, the best way to protect yourself from deception is to be knowledgeable and aware. Be critical of what you see and question what you think you know, and look for different viewpoints.
Now, before we go, we have a small favor to ask. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Maskirovka, please like this episode on YouTube and subscribe to our channel. Sharing it with your friends would be awesome too.
And join the All Sorts podcast community on X, Instagram, and Threads. You can talk about the show, share your thoughts, and connect with other curious people.
We have tons of other episodes waiting for you on all kinds of topics. From history and science to culture and what's happening in the world right now, we're passionate about exploring the curious and captivating. And we're so glad you're here with us.
So until next time, keep those curious minds engaged, stay vigilant, and remember, in a world where deception is everywhere, knowledge is your best weapon.
This is the All Source podcast signing off. Happy exploring.
It's a tool that can be incredibly effective in this kind of environment. The digital age has amplified the core principles of Maskirovka in a lot of ways. Just think about how easy it is to manipulate stories online and use social media to spread propaganda and create chaos.
Yeah, it's like that fog of war has spread from the battlefield to our whole information ecosystem. We're constantly bombarded with conflicting stories and different claims. It's getting harder and harder to figure out what's real and what's fake.
Exactly. And in this environment where truth is constantly being challenged, Maskirovka becomes even more potent. It's not just about deceiving military opponents anymore. It's about shaping public opinion, influencing political discussions, even manipulating financial markets.
So what does that mean for us? Are we just stuck being manipulated by forces we can't even see?
Not necessarily, but we do need to be more aware than ever. We have to develop a healthy skepticism, question the information we come across, and be wary of stories that seem too perfect or too aligned with what we already believe.
So is critical thinking our best weapon against Maskirovka?
It's definitely a crucial first step. We need to be aware that deception is out there, recognize the tactics, and learn how to separate truth from lies. And remember, Maskirovka often targets our emotions, our biases, our desire for simple explanations.
So we need to recognize our own weaknesses, our tendency to believe what we want to believe, even when the evidence doesn't support it.
Exactly. Maskirovka flourishes in those gray areas, those gaps between what we know and what we assume. By examining those gray areas, by questioning our assumptions, and by actively seeking out different perspectives, we can start to see through the deception.
That's a really important point. It's not about becoming cynical or distrusting everything, but about developing a more critical mind and understanding how information can be used as a weapon in the modern world.
Exactly. Maskirovka is a reminder that the information landscape is a battlefield, and we're all part of this fight for truth and perception.
This has been a really eye-opening and thought-provoking deep dive. It's shown me a whole new side of strategic thinking, where deception isn't just a tactic, but a way of life, a philosophy that shapes how we see the world and interact with it.
I've really enjoyed exploring this fascinating and complex topic with you. And remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to understanding how deception works.
And that brings us to the end of another fascinating episode of the All Sorts podcast. We've taken a deep dive into Maskirovka, the Soviet system of camouflage, exploring its history, principles, and how it's evolved in the digital age.
We've seen how Maskirovka has influenced major events in history, from epic battles to critical political moments, and we've discussed what it means for us today in a world where it's becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish reality from illusion.
If you're as intrigued by Maskirovka as we are, make sure to check out the sources we mentioned, especially NSDD 108 and CIA RDP 83 M000000000023000019. They offer a wealth of information about this captivating and often unsettling world of strategic deception.
And remember, the best way to counter deception is through knowledge and awareness. Be critical of the information you encounter, question your assumptions, and always seek out diverse perspectives.
Now, before we sign off, we have a small favor to ask. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Maskirovka, we'd really appreciate it if you could like this video on YouTube and subscribe to our channel for more explorations of the curious and captivating. And sharing this episode with your friends would be amazing.
Don't forget to join the All Sorts podcast community on X, Instagram, and Threads. It's a great place to discuss the show, share your thoughts, and connect with other curious minds from around the world.
We have a whole library of episodes waiting for you, covering a huge range of topics, from history and science to culture and current events. We love exploring the fascinating corners of the world, and we're thrilled to have you along for the journey.
Until next time, keep those curious minds engaged, stay vigilant, and remember, in a world filled with deception, knowledge is your most powerful tool.
This is the All Sorts Podcast. Signing off. Happy exploring.